In the hours before dawn on November 5th, 1605, a man named Thomas Knivet descended a narrow stone staircase beneath the Palace of Westminster. He carried a royal warrant that gave him authority to search every shadow, every forgotten corner of the ancient building above him. Behind him, armed guards followed with torches that cast wild dancing light on damp stone walls. The cellars beneath Parliament were a labyrinth of darkness, rooms filled with coal for winter fires, vaults stacked with old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs, and everywhere, the cold, heavy smell of the River Thames seeping through cracks in the foundation. The air was thick and still, untouched by sunlight for centuries. Knivet moved deeper into the maze, following a tip that had reached the king just hours before. His torch revealed a rented storage vault directly beneath the House of Lords. And there, standing in the shadows like a statue carved from stone, he found him. A tall man with the hard, weathered face of a soldier, dark eyes that showed no fear, no surprise. He was dressed for travel, booted and spurred, a cloak around his shoulders, as if he'd been preparing to leave in a hurry. He was standing guard over something hidden beneath piles of firewood and coal. Knivet ordered his men forward. They began moving the fuel aside, piece by piece. And then they saw what lay beneath. 36 wooden barrels stamped with gunpowder merchants' marks. 1,800 pounds of explosive, enough to turn the entire Palace of Westminster into a crater of smoking rubble. Enough to kill every man, woman and child within 100 yards. Enough to erase the government of England in a single, apocalyptic blast. Knivet turned to the stranger, his voice steady despite the horror of what they'd discovered. "What is your name? What is your business here?" The man met his eyes with a cold, defiant stare. His voice was calm, almost bored, as if discussing the weather rather than mass murder. "To blow you Scotch beggars back to Scotland." This presents a terrifying puzzle. This wasn't a madman raving in the dark. This was a professional, a decorated military veteran, an expert in siege warfare and demolition. A man who had spent months living in this cellar, guarding his barrels of death with the patience of a spider in its web. A Catholic gentleman who had been willing to become the greatest mass murderer in English history. The question is, how? How does a soldier for hire become willing to die while obliterating a king, a government, and hundreds of innocent people? How does faith twist a man's soul until murder becomes a holy mission? Before we continue this story, I want to ask you something. If you believe these dark chapters of history deserve to be remembered, if you believe the truth about our past should not be buried, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing. Your support keeps the candle lit and allows us to keep exploring the shadows. Tonight, we will descend into the cellars of Westminster. We will trace the making of England's most infamous terrorist. From the soldier forged in religious war, to the conspiracy of Catholic gentlemen who recruited him. From the months spent living in darkness with enough explosive to level London, to the torture that broke him. From the desperate flight and brutal executions to the mask of rebellion that conquered the world. This is not just the story of one man with a match. It is the story of religious persecution, of desperate faith, of a plot so audacious that its failure required either divine intervention or the greatest spy operation in English history. This is the story of the Gunpowder Treason. The night England almost died. The devil beneath Parliament. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. To understand the man in the cellar, you must first understand the world that made him. And that world was a kingdom at war with itself. England in the late 1500s was a nation split down the middle by something more powerful than politics, more divisive than any army. It was split by God, or rather, by two different ideas of God, locked in a death struggle for the soul of the nation. For centuries, England had been Catholic. The Pope in Rome was the ultimate religious authority. Priests said Mass in Latin. Cathedrals and monasteries dotted the landscape like jewels in a crown. But then King Henry VIII wanted a divorce his Catholic faith would not allow. And so, in the 1530s, he broke with Rome, seized the monasteries, and declared himself the head of a new Church of England. What followed was a religious civil war that lasted generations. Queen Mary, Henry's Catholic daughter, burned hundreds of Protestants at the stake, earning the title Bloody Mary. Then her sister, Queen Elizabeth, flipped the kingdom Protestant again. Catholic priests were hunted like criminals. Catholic families were fined into poverty. Catholic worship became treason. If you were caught saying Mass or harboring a priest, you could be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the most brutal execution the law allowed. By the time Guy Fawkes was born in 1570, being Catholic in England meant living in constant fear. It meant hiding your faith like a shameful secret. It meant lying every single day about who you really were. Imagine growing up in a world where your prayers could get you killed, where attending church, not a wild party or a criminal act, but simply going to church, could result in your entire family being arrested, tortured, and executed, where priests moved through the countryside in disguise, saying secret masses in hidden rooms, while families kept watch for the soldiers who hunted them. This was the world of English Catholics, a world of whispers, hidden compartments behind walls, and the constant gnawing terror that today might be the day the priest hunters knocked on your door. This was the world that would forge Guy Fawkes into a weapon. Guy Fawkes was born in the city of York, in northern England, in the spring of 1570. His father, Edward Fawkes, was a respectable man, a notary and advocate at the church courts. The family was comfortably middle class, neither rich nor poor, and they were Protestant, or at least they appeared to be. In England in 1570, appearance was everything. Young Guy was baptized in the Protestant faith at St. Michael le Belfry Church in York. To all outward appearances, he was a normal Protestant boy in a normal Protestant family, living a normal Protestant life in the northern capital. But then, when Guy was just 8 years old, his father died. Death changes everything, but especially for a child. The world Guy knew, stable, predictable, safe, vanished overnight. His mother, Edith, was left a widow with young children to raise. And within a few years, she made a decision that would shape the rest of Guy's life. She remarried. The man she chose was named Dionysius Bainbrig, and Dionysius Bainbrig was a secret Catholic. Suddenly, young Guy found himself living in a very different kind of household. Outwardly, nothing changed. The family still attended Protestant services when required by law. They still appeared in public as loyal subjects of the Protestant Queen. But behind closed doors, everything was transformed. Secret compartments were built into the walls of the house, spaces just large enough to hide a man. These priest holes were where visiting Catholic priests could hide when the authorities came searching. Midnight masses were held in the attic, whispered in Latin, with lookouts posted at every entrance. The family learned to speak in code, to trust no one outside their inner circle, to live two completely separate lives. For young Guy, this was his education in secrecy. This was where he learned that the world was divided into two faces, the one you showed in public and the one you kept hidden in the dark. He learned that survival meant deception. He learned that faith was something you protected with lies. And as he grew into a teenager, he made a choice. He converted to the Catholic faith of his stepfather. This wasn't a casual decision. This was choosing to be a criminal. This was choosing to join a hunted minority in his own country. This was choosing the faith that would make him, by definition, a traitor. Why would a young man make such a choice? Perhaps it was love for his stepfather. Perhaps it was genuine spiritual conviction. Or perhaps, for a young man looking at a world that offered him no future, no opportunity, and no hope, there was something intoxicating about choosing the dangerous path, about joining the resistance. Whatever his reasons, Guy Fawkes became a Catholic. And with that choice, he closed every door to a normal life in Protestant England. He could never hold office, never attend university, never advance in society. His faith marked him as a permanent outsider in his own homeland. But there was one path still open to a young Catholic man with no prospects and a burning sense of injustice. He could leave. He could go to Catholic Europe, where men of his faith were not criminals, but heroes. He could become a soldier. And so, in 1593, at the age of 23, Guy Fawkes made another choice. He sold whatever small inheritance his father had left him. He said goodbye to his family, and he walked away from England, perhaps believing he would never return. He crossed the Channel to the Spanish Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, where the great Catholic power of Europe, Spain, was locked in a brutal, decades-long war with Protestant Dutch rebels. And there, in the blood and fire of Europe's religious wars, Guy Fawkes would be reborn. The young man who arrived in the Spanish Netherlands in 1593 was Guy Fawkes, English Catholic exile, son of a notary, with no military experience and no particular skills beyond a good education and a burning hatred of Protestant England. The man who would emerge 10 years later was someone else entirely. He called himself Guido, not Guy, but the Spanish version of his name. Guido Fawkes. It was more than a name change. It was a complete reinvention. He had left England as a victim, but he would return as a weapon. The Spanish army welcomed him with open arms. Catholic exiles from England were valuable recruits. They spoke English, knew English geography, and had personal reasons to hate the Protestant enemy. If Spain ever invaded England, a dream that had died with the Spanish Armada's failure in 1588 but still flickered in strategic minds, these men would be invaluable. Guido Fawkes joined a terzo, a Spanish infantry regiment, and was sent to fight in Flanders. And there, in the grinding, endless siege warfare of the Dutch revolt, he received an education that no university could provide. This was not the romantic warfare of knights and cavalry charges. This was modern warfare, brutal and scientific. Armies dug miles of trenches around fortified cities and starved them into submission. Engineers tunneled beneath walls to plant explosives. Gunpowder had transformed war from a contest of courage into a contest of engineering and mathematics. And Guy Fawkes became very, very good at it. He learned the science of explosives, how to calculate exactly how much gunpowder was needed to collapse a wall of a certain thickness, how to dig a tunnel that wouldn't collapse before you reached your target, how to place charges for maximum effect, how to time fuses to the second. This was cutting-edge military technology, and Guido was an excellent student, but he learned more than just technical skills. He learned patience. Siege warfare was about waiting, weeks, months, sometimes years, for the perfect moment to strike. He learned to live with danger as a constant companion, to sleep next to barrels of gunpowder and tunnels that could collapse at any moment. He learned that a soldier's greatest weapon was not his sword, but his nerve, and he proved he had nerve in abundance. His commanders noted his bravery under fire. He was calm, disciplined, and utterly reliable. While other men panicked when the guns opened up, Guy Fawkes went about his work with the calm focus of a craftsman. He rose through the ranks, earning respect from Spanish officers who were normally dismissive of foreign recruits. For 10 years, he lived this life. The battlefields of Flanders became his home. The Spanish army became his family. Catholic Europe became his world. And for the first time in his life, he didn't have to hide who he was. He could practice his faith openly. He could attend Mass without fear. He could be, simply, himself. But he never forgot England. How could he? Every battle he fought was part of the great religious war between Catholic and Protestant Europe. And England, Protestant, powerful, rich, was the enemy's greatest champion. Every Protestant Dutch rebel he fought was a stand-in for the English oppressors who had driven him into exile. In quiet moments, around campfires after battles, Guido and his fellow English Catholic exiles would talk about home, about the day when Catholic armies would return to England, when the Protestant regime would fall, when they could go home, not as criminals, but as liberators. It was a beautiful dream. And as the years passed, it began to feel less and less likely to come true. By 1603, Guy Fawkes was a 33-year-old veteran soldier with a decade of combat experience. He had earned a reputation as one of the Spanish army's most reliable military engineers. He was respected, experienced, and deeply committed to the Catholic cause. But he was also growing restless. The war in Flanders had settled into a bloody stalemate. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage. And more importantly, it was becoming clear that Spain had no real plans to invade England. King Philip II, who had launched the Great Armada of 1588, was dead. His son, Philip III, was less interested in crusades and more interested in balancing the treasury of an empire stretched too thin. Meanwhile, in England, things had changed. Queen Elizabeth had died in 1603, ending the Tudor dynasty. The new king was James I, a Scottish Protestant who now ruled both Scotland and England in a personal union. Many Catholics had hoped that James, whose mother was the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots, might show them mercy. Those hopes were quickly crushed. James proved to be just as hostile to Catholics as Elizabeth had been, perhaps more so. The fines continued, the persecution continued. priests continued to be hunted and executed. For English Catholics, nothing had changed except the name of their oppressor. Guy Fawkes watched all this from Europe, and something hardened inside him. He had been patient. He had been loyal. He had fought Spain's wars, believing that one day Spain would fight for English Catholics. But that day was never going to come. So in 1603, Guido decided to take matters into his own hands. He traveled to the Spanish court and requested an audience with King Philip III. It was a bold move for a simple soldier, but Guido had the support of his commanding officers, who respected his judgment. And what he proposed was even bolder. His petition was simple: Spain should invade England. He laid out his reasoning with the clarity of a military engineer. England was distracted by the transition to a new king. Ireland, a Catholic nation under English occupation, was ready to revolt. English Catholics would rise up to support a Spanish invasion. The time was perfect. Philip listened. His advisors considered the proposal, and then they gave their answer. Number: Spain was broke. The treasury was empty. The wars in Flanders and elsewhere had drained the country's wealth. An invasion of England was simply too expensive, too risky, too unlikely to succeed. Philip thanked Guido for his service and sent him back to the army. For Guy Fawkes, this was a devastating blow. The dream that had sustained him for a decade, the dream of returning home in a liberating army, of seeing his faith restored by foreign swords, was dead. No one was coming to save English Catholics. No foreign king, no invading army, no divine intervention. If they wanted to be free, they would have to free themselves. Guido returned to the Spanish Netherlands, bitter and burning with a sense of wasted time. He was 33 years old, highly trained, and had nowhere to direct his skills. He went through the motions of his duties, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. And then, in the spring of 1604, a letter arrived from England. It was from a man named Thomas Wintour, an English Catholic gentleman whom Guido had met briefly years before. Wintour was traveling through Europe on mysterious business, and he wanted to meet. The letter was carefully worded, revealing nothing specific. But between the lines, there was a hint of something dangerous, something that would make the Spanish invasion look like a child's game. Guido agreed to meet, and when Thomas Wintour finally sat across from him in a quiet tavern and explained the plan, Guy Fawkes felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Not hope for a distant miracle, not hope that someone else would solve the problem, but hope that he, personally, with his own two hands and his soldier's skills, could strike a blow that would change everything. Thomas Wintour had come with an invitation to join a conspiracy, a small group of Catholic gentlemen in England who were planning something unprecedented, something apocalyptic. They were going to kill the King of England, but not with a dagger in a dark alley, not with poison in his wine. They were going to blow him to pieces, along with his entire government, in a single devastating explosion. And they needed a man who knew how to make the earth itself erupt in fire. Wintour looked at Guido across the table and asked the question that would change history. "Will you join us?" Guy Fawkes didn't hesitate. After 10 years of waiting, of hoping, of praying for deliverance that never came, someone was finally offering him a chance to act. He said yes. The soldier was about to become a terrorist, and England was about to face the greatest threat in its history. Before we follow Guy Fawkes across the Channel to England and into the darkness beneath Westminster, we must first meet the man who summoned him. The man whose vision would come within hours of erasing the English government from existence. The man who had no interest in foreign invasions or peaceful reform. His name was Robert Catesby, and he was exactly the kind of man who could convince others to die for his dreams. Catesby was everything Guy Fawkes was not. Where Guy was a commoner and a soldier, Catesby was a gentleman of ancient lineage and inherited wealth. Where Guy had lived in exile, scraping by on a soldier's pay, Catesby owned a grand estate at Ashby St Ledgers in Northamptonshire. Where Guy was a blunt instrument, Catesby was a silver tongue. He was handsome, tall, athletic, with dark eyes that seemed to see into your soul. He had the kind of charisma that made men want to follow him into battle or into treason. One contemporary described him as having such an attractive personality that people who conversed with him generally loved and esteemed him. But beneath the surface, charm was something much darker. Robert Catesby was a man consumed by rage, by grief, and by an unshakable belief that God had chosen him for something terrible and necessary. His life had been marked by loss. His wife had died young, leaving him to raise a son alone. His family's fortune had been devastated by crushing fines imposed by the government simply for being Catholic. Every year, Catholics who refused to attend Protestant services were fined £20, an enormous sum that could bankrupt even wealthy families. The Catesbys, who stubbornly clung to their faith, were slowly being bled dry by their own government. But the turning point for Robert Catesby came in 1601, when he participated in the Essex Rebellion, a failed coup attempt by the Earl of Essex against Queen Elizabeth. The rebellion was crushed in days. Essex was beheaded, and Catesby was fined an additional 4,000 marks, a sum so vast it forced him to sell his family estates. He had gambled everything on rebellion and lost. Most men would have learned caution from such a disaster. Most men would have retreated into quiet bitterness, nursing their wounds in private. But Robert Catesby learned something else entirely. He learned that half measures don't work. He learned that trying to replace one ruler with another wasn't enough. The entire system was rotten, and it needed to be torn out by the roots. When Queen Elizabeth died in 1603 and King James took the throne, Catholics across England dared to hope. James's mother had been Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic martyr executed by Elizabeth. Surely James would show mercy to his mother's co-religionists. But James crushed those hopes immediately. In 1604, he issued a proclamation ordering all Catholic priests to leave England. The persecution would continue. Nothing would change. For Robert Catesby, this was the final proof. Negotiation was useless. Petitions were useless. Waiting for mercy from Protestant kings was useless. There was only one language the Protestant state would understand, and that was violence. But not ordinary violence. Not a simple assassination. That had been tried before and achieved nothing. What England needed was something unprecedented. Something so massive, so shocking, that it would paralyze the nation and create space for a Catholic restoration. Catesby's vision was breathtaking in its audacity. He would wait until the state opening of Parliament, that annual ceremony when the king, all the lords, all the members of Commons, all the bishops, the entire ruling class of Protestant England gathered in one room. And then he would blow them all to hell in a single apocalyptic moment. It would decapitate the Protestant state so completely that Catholics could seize control before anyone realized what had happened. And this time, there would be no half measures. This time, they would not fail. But a vision, no matter how grand, requires hands to make it real. And so, in the spring of 1604, Robert Catesby began gathering his disciples. On Sunday, May 20th, 1604, 5 men gathered in a room at an inn called the Duck and Drake on the Strand in London. They had arrived separately at different times, drawing no attention. Meetings of Catholics, even peaceful ones, were dangerous. This meeting was something else entirely. The 5 men had known each other for years. They were all Catholic gentlemen, all from the Midlands region of England, all bound together by ties of faith, family, and shared persecution. And all of them had been recruited by Robert Catesby, who had spoken to each one privately, gauging their willingness to cross a line from which there could be no return. Besides Catesby, there was Thomas Wintour, an educated man who spoke multiple languages and had travelled extensively in Catholic Europe. Wintour was Catesby's cousin and his most trusted lieutenant. He would be the conspiracy's diplomat and recruiter. Thomas Percy was older than the others, in his mid-40s. He had something the others didn't: access. Percy was a gentleman pensioner, a member of the king's bodyguard. He had the right to enter royal buildings, to move freely around the court. He was the inside man. John Wright was the muscle. A skilled swordsman and soldier, Wright was the kind of man you wanted at your side when words failed and violence began. He was utterly loyal to Catesby and utterly committed to the Catholic cause. And finally, there was Kit Wright, John's younger brother, cut from the same cloth. These 4 men represented different strengths: diplomacy, access, military skill, but Catesby knew they were missing something crucial. None of them were experts in the weapon that would make or break the conspiracy. Gunpowder. Wars in the 1600s were fought with swords and pikes, but they were won with explosives. Gunpowder had revolutionized warfare, and using it effectively required specialized knowledge. Calculating the amount needed to destroy a building wasn't guesswork. It was engineering. It required someone who had trained in siege warfare, who understood the mathematics of destruction. They needed an expert, and Catesby knew exactly where to find one. "There is a man," Catesby said, "in the Spanish Netherlands. An English exile who has served in the Spanish army for years. He is a soldier experienced in war. And more importantly, he is an expert in explosives and tunneling. His name is Guy Fawkes." Thomas Wintour knew the name. He had met Fawkes briefly years before and had been impressed by the man's quiet competence and burning faith. If anyone could make their vision reality, it was Guido. "I will go to Europe," Wintour said. "I will bring him back." And so it was decided. Thomas Wintour would travel to the Spanish Netherlands under the pretense of diplomatic business. He would find Guy Fawkes, explain the plan, and recruit him to the conspiracy. Before they left that room, the 5 men did something extraordinary. They walked to a nearby house where a priest was hiding, a Jesuit named Father John Gerard. They requested that he give them Mass, a Catholic ceremony that was illegal and punishable by death in Protestant England. The priest, unaware of their true purpose, agreed. He gave them communion, the body and blood of Christ. And in that moment, the 5 conspirators believed they were not just planning murder. They were embarking on a holy mission, blessed by God Himself. This would be their justification, their armor against doubt. They were not terrorists. They were crusaders. They were not committing a crime. They were doing God's work. It was a lie they would tell themselves right up until the moment they were caught. Thomas Winter crossed the English Channel in early June of 1604, traveling under false pretenses as a gentleman on business. When he reached the Spanish Netherlands, he began making inquiries about the English exile known as Guy Fawkes. Finding him wasn't difficult. The English Catholic exile community in Europe was small, and a soldier of Fawkes's reputation was well known. Within days, Winter had tracked him down. They met in a tavern in Brussels, two Englishmen far from home, speaking carefully in case anyone was listening. Winter didn't reveal the plan immediately. First, he had to gauge the man's commitment, his willingness to act. He started with questions. How did Fawkes feel about the situation in England? Did he believe Spain would ever invade? Did he think peaceful coexistence with the Protestant state was possible? Guido's answers confirmed what Winter had hoped. The soldier was bitter, disillusioned, and ready for action. Spain had rejected his petition for an invasion. He saw no hope on the horizon. He was, in short, exactly the kind of man who might embrace a desperate and violent plan. Only then did Winter begin to reveal the conspiracy. He spoke carefully, watching Guido's reaction. "There are men in England," he said, "who believe that negotiation has failed, that petitions and pleas will never work. Men who believe that only decisive action can change our situation." Guido listened, his soldier's face unreadable. "What kind of action?" he asked. Winter leaned closer. "The kind that would end this war in a single night." And then, in that tavern far from England, Thomas Winter laid out Robert Catesby's vision in full. The target, the state opening of Parliament. The timing, when the King, the Lords, the Commons, and the bishops were all assembled in one place. The method, gunpowder. Not a keg or two, but enough to reduce the entire Palace of Westminster to smoking rubble. Enough to erase the Protestant government of England in one perfect, terrible moment. The aftermath. With the government destroyed, Catholics across England would rise up. They would seize control before the nation recovered from the shock. They would place a Catholic monarch on the throne, perhaps Princess Elizabeth, the king's 9-year-old daughter who could be molded into a proper Catholic queen. England would be theirs. It was audacious. It was unprecedented. It was, quite possibly, insane. And Guy Fawkes loved it. This wasn't a distant dream of Spanish armies liberating England. This was something he could do himself, with his own hands and his own skills. This was the kind of decisive action he had been craving for years. This was a soldier's mission, precise and clear. "How much gunpowder would you need?" Winter asked. Guido thought for a moment, calculating. "To destroy the entire building with everyone inside. At least 30 barrels, perhaps more. Can you get it into position?" "If we have access to a cellar or vault beneath the building, yes." "The question isn't whether it can be done. The question is whether you have men brave enough to do it." Winter smiled. "Robert Catesby is such a man, and he believes you are as well." There was a long silence. Outside, the sounds of the city drifted through the tavern windows. Guy Fawkes sat very still, and in that moment, he made the choice that would define the rest of his life and echo through 4 centuries of history. When do we begin? Guy Fawkes returned to England with Thomas Wintour in the late summer of 1604. He had been gone for 11 years, and the country he found when he landed was both familiar and strange. The language was the same, the geography unchanged, but he was coming back as an enemy agent, a man with a soldier's training and a terrorist's purpose. The 5 conspirators, Catesby, Wintour, Percy, Wright, and now Fawkes, met again in London. This time, the meeting was not about whether to act, but how. The vision had been accepted. Now came the practical work of turning apocalypse into reality. Catesby presented the plan in full. The target was confirmed. The state opening of Parliament, a formal ceremony that took place every year when Parliament was in session. On that day, the king would arrive in his royal robes and take his seat in the House of Lords. The Lords would be in attendance in their finest dress. The members of the House of Commons would be summoned to the Lords' chamber to hear the king's speech outlining his government's agenda. In other words, on that single day, in that single room, every person of importance in the English government would be gathered together. The king, the heir to the throne, Prince Henry, the great nobles, the bishops, the judges, the politicians, all of them in one space, beautifully vulnerable. The date was set for the next state opening in February 1605. That gave them less than a year to prepare. The method was equally clear. They would place a massive quantity of gunpowder beneath the House of Lords. Guido, with his military expertise, would be responsible for calculating the precise amount needed, placing the charges, and lighting the fuse. The timing would be crucial. The explosion had to occur when everyone was assembled, but it also had to allow the conspirators time to escape. Guido calculated that a slow-burning fuse could give them about 15 minutes, enough time to light it and ride out of London before the blast. The aftermath was where the plan became truly ambitious. The explosion would create chaos. London would be paralyzed, and in that moment of confusion, the remaining conspirators would act. They would ride to the Midlands, where Catholic support was strongest. They would kidnap Princess Elizabeth from her residence at Combe Abbey. With the king and his heir dead, Elizabeth would be the highest-ranking survivor of the royal family. The conspirators would declare her queen, control her government, and restore Catholicism as England's official faith. It was a fantasy, of course. The idea that a nation of mostly Protestants would simply accept a Catholic coup was naive at best, but the conspirators were true believers. They convinced themselves that Catholics across England were waiting for a signal, that ordinary people would welcome the change, that God would guide their cause to victory. All they had to do was light the match. But before they could do any of that, they needed 2 things: access to a space beneath the House of Lords and an enormous quantity of gunpowder. Thomas Percy, with his government connections, would handle the access. Guy Fawkes would handle the explosives, and for his role to work, he would need a new identity. Guy Fawkes, Spanish Army veteran and Catholic exile, was too conspicuous. If anyone checked his background, the conspiracy would be exposed. So he became someone else. He became John Johnson, a humble servant in the household of Thomas Percy, a nobody, a face in the crowd, a man so unremarkable that no one would think to question his presence near Parliament. The trap was set. Now all they had to do was spring it. In December 1604, Thomas Percy made arrangements to rent a property in Westminster, very close to the palace. It was a small house with a cellar, and most importantly, it shared a wall with Parliament. The location was perfect. Percy moved in, bringing with him his servant, John Johnson, who was, of course, Guy Fawkes in disguise. To the neighbours, they appeared to be exactly what they claimed, a gentleman and his manservant living quietly in Westminster while Parliament was in recess. But beneath the house, in the cellar, something else was happening. The conspirators had decided on a bold approach. They would dig a tunnel from Percy's cellar under the foundations of Parliament and into a vault directly beneath the House of Lords. Once the tunnel was complete, they would pack it with gunpowder and wait for the state opening. It was back-breaking work. Catesby, Wintour, Percy, Fawkes, and a few newly recruited conspirators took turns digging. They worked at night, when the streets were empty and the sounds of their labor wouldn't draw attention. They hauled away buckets of dirt and stone, dumping them in the Thames. They braced the tunnel with wooden supports to prevent collapse. Guido, with his military engineering experience, supervised the work. He calculated angles, measured distances, and ensured the tunnel was heading in the right direction. This was siege warfare tactics applied to domestic terrorism, a strange and terrible application of his soldiers' skills. For weeks, they dug. The work was exhausting, filthy, and dangerous. The tunnel could collapse at any moment. They were working beneath one of the most heavily guarded buildings in England, and discovery would mean immediate execution. But they pressed on, driven by Catesby's vision and their own desperate faith. And then, in March 1605, something remarkable happened. They learned that a cellar directly beneath the House of Lords, a storage vault used by Parliament to keep coal and firewood, was available to rent. They didn't need the tunnel after all. Thomas Percy, using his government credentials, rented the vault without raising suspicion. Suddenly, the conspirators had direct access to the perfect location. No need for dangerous digging, no need for weeks of risky labor. They had a room with a locked door right beneath their target. It seemed like a miracle, like divine providence confirming that they were on the right path. But it was also the first hint that their conspiracy might not be as secret as they believed. With the vault secured, the conspirators began the most critical phase of their plan, moving the gunpowder into position. 36 barrels were purchased from various merchants across London. Buying that much explosive from one source would have raised suspicions, so they spread the purchases out. Each barrel contained about 50 pounds of gunpowder, a mixture of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur that was the most powerful explosive of the age. In total, they acquired 1,800 pounds of gunpowder. Guy Fawkes, with his military training, calculated that this was more than enough to obliterate the House of Lords and everyone in it. In fact, modern experts have estimated that the explosion would have destroyed not just Parliament, but a significant portion of Westminster, creating a crater 30 feet deep and killing everyone within 100 yards. The conspirators moved the barrels into the rented vault, slowly, carefully, a few at a time, to avoid drawing attention. They disguised the barrels beneath piles of firewood and coal. Since the vault was used for storing fuel anyway, this wouldn't seem unusual to anyone who happened to glance inside. Once all 36 barrels were in place, hidden beneath their camouflage of ordinary firewood, the vault was locked, and Guy Fawkes, still playing his role as John Johnson, was installed as the permanent watchman. His job was simple but critical. He would live in the house above the vault, keep watch over the explosives, and ensure that nothing went wrong before the appointed day. He was the guardian of England's doom, and he took his duty seriously. For Guido, the months that followed were a strange kind of limbo. By day, he played his part as a humble servant, running errands for Thomas Percy, nodding politely to neighbours, living the life of an invisible nobody. By night, he would descend into the vault and check on his deadly cargo. He developed a routine. Every few days, he would inspect the barrels, making sure the powder hadn't gotten damp or degraded. He would test the slow matches and touch paper he'd prepared for lighting the fuse. He would calculate and recalculate the timing, how long the fuse would burn, how much time he would have to escape. And then he would sit in the darkness, surrounded by enough explosive to level half of Westminster, and wait. The state opening of Parliament, originally scheduled for February, was postponed due to a plague outbreak in London. The new date was set for November 5th, 1605. For Guy Fawkes, that meant 8 months of waiting, 8 months of living with his barrels of death, 8 months of playing his part, maintaining his cover, and preparing for the moment when he would strike his blow for God and faith. He was patient, he was disciplined, he was ready. But what he didn't know, what none of the conspirators knew, was that the walls of their conspiracy were already beginning to crack. As summer turned to autumn in 1605, Robert Catesby's conspiracy was at its peak. The gunpowder was in place. Guy Fawkes stood ready. The date, November 5th, was fast approaching. Everything was proceeding according to plan. But the conspiracy was also getting bigger. And bigger conspiracies are harder to keep secret. In the beginning, there had been 5 men: Catesby, Wintour, Percy, Wright, and Fawkes. 5 men who knew each other well, who trusted each other completely. But as the plan developed, it became clear that they would need more help. The gunpowder had to be purchased and transported. The aftermath of the explosion would require a small army to seize control and kidnap Princess Elizabeth. Safe houses would be needed across the Midlands for the conspirators to gather after the deed was done. All of this required money, manpower, and resources. And so, one by one, new conspirators were recruited. Robert Keyes, an expert in logistics. Ambrose Rookwood, a wealthy gentleman with money to contribute. John Grant and Thomas Bates, men willing to take action after the explosion. And finally, Sir Everard Digby, a handsome, wealthy, well-connected nobleman who could provide cover and resources. By October 1605, there were 13 conspirators, 13 men who knew the plot, 13 men who had sworn oaths of secrecy, and 13 men who each represented a potential point of failure. The more people who knew a secret, the more likely it was that someone would talk, or make a mistake, or have second thoughts, and one of them did. His name was Francis Tresham. He was a wealthy Catholic gentleman who had been recruited late in the conspiracy, primarily because he had money that Catesby needed. But Tresham was different from the others. He was less idealistic, more practical, and as November approached, he began to realize the true horror of what they were planning. The original 5 conspirators, hardened by years of persecution, military service, or personal tragedy, had convinced themselves that their cause justified any means. They had numbed themselves to the moral weight of mass murder. But Tresham couldn't do it. He lay awake at night thinking about the explosion. Yes, it would kill King James and his Protestant government, but it would also kill Catholics. Catholic nobles who served in the House of Lords, Catholic servants who worked in the palace, perhaps even women and children who happened to be nearby. And one man in particular haunted Tresham's conscience: his brother-in-law, Lord Monteagle. William Parker, Lord Monteagle, was a Catholic sympathizer, a nobleman who had been kind to Catholics, even though he outwardly conformed to the Protestant state. He would certainly attend the state opening, and he would certainly die in the explosion. Tresham couldn't let that happen, but he also couldn't betray his fellow conspirators directly. If he went to the authorities and named names, he would be signing his own death warrant as well as theirs. So he chose a middle path, a compromise, a warning that might save some lives without exposing the full conspiracy. He would send an anonymous letter. On the evening of October the 26th, 1605, just 10 days before the state opening of Parliament, a mysterious servant appeared at Lord Monteagle's house in Hoxton, on the outskirts of London. The servant said he had a letter for his lordship. It had been given to him by a stranger in the street, who paid him to deliver it and then vanished into the crowd. The servant didn't know who the stranger was. He was simply doing as he'd been paid to do. Lord Monteagle took the letter, tipped the servant, and broke the seal. Inside was a single page, written in a hasty scrawl, with no signature. As he read, his blood turned cold. The letter read, "My lord, out of the love I bear to some of your friends, I have a care of your preservation. Therefore, I would advise you, as you tender your life, to devise some excuse to shift your attendance at this Parliament. For God and man hath concurred to punish the wickedness of this time. And think not slightly of this advertisement, but retire yourself into your country, where you may expect the event in safety. For though there be no appearance of any stir, yet I say they shall receive a terrible blow this Parliament, and yet they shall not see who hurts them. This counsel is not to be condemned, because it may do you good, and can do you no harm, for the danger is past, as soon as you have burnt the letter, and I hope God will give you the grace to make good use of it, to whose holy protection I commend you." Monteagle read it once, then again. His hands began to shake. This was a warning, an anonymous tip, that something catastrophic was planned for the state opening of Parliament. A terrible blow that would strike without warning, that they shall not see who hurts them. It could be a prank, a mad raving, or it could be real. Lord Monteagle was not a particularly brave man, but he was a survivor. He made a decision immediately. He would take this letter to the authorities. If it was nothing, he would look foolish. But if it was real, if something truly terrible was planned, then reporting it would save his life and possibly earn him gratitude from the king. That same night, Monteagle rode to Whitehall Palace and requested an urgent audience with Robert Cecil, the Earl of Salisbury, Secretary of State, and the most powerful man in England after the king. And when Cecil read that letter, his thin lips curled into something that might have been a smile. To understand what happened next, you must understand Robert Cecil. Because the story of the Gunpowder Plot is not just about Catholic conspirators trying to blow up Parliament. It's also about one of history's greatest spymasters, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Robert Cecil was a small man, hunched and slightly deformed from birth. He stood barely over 5 feet tall, with a twisted spine that gave him a permanent stoop. In an age when physical prowess was prized, Cecil's body made him an object of mockery. Behind his back, people called him the Crooked Elf or Robert the Devil. But what his body lacked, his mind more than compensated for. Cecil was brilliant, ruthless, and utterly dedicated to the preservation of Protestant England and his own power within it. He had inherited his position from his father, William Cecil, who had been Queen Elizabeth's spymaster and chief minister for decades. Robert had learned statecraft at his father's knee, and he had learned well. When James I took the throne in 1603, Cecil smoothly transitioned from Elizabeth's government to James's, maintaining his position as Secretary of State. And with that position came control of England's intelligence network. Cecil had spies across Europe. His agents infiltrated Catholic circles in England and abroad, reporting on meetings, letters, and whispers of conspiracy. He knew about every significant Catholic plot before it even got off the ground. His network was so extensive that it was said nothing happened in Catholic Europe that didn't reach his desk within days. So when Lord Monteagle handed him the anonymous letter warning of an attack on Parliament, Robert Cecil was not surprised. In fact, there is strong evidence that he had been aware of the Gunpowder Plot for weeks, possibly months. His spies had reported increased activity among known Catholic radicals, unusual purchases of gunpowder, whispered meetings in London taverns, none of it concrete enough to act on, but enough to know that something was brewing. The letter from Monteagle confirmed what Cecil already suspected. A group of Catholic conspirators were planning an attack on Parliament, and now Cecil had a choice to make. He could act immediately, arrest everyone, search Parliament, seize the gunpowder, and prevent the attack before it came close to succeeding. Or he could wait, let the conspiracy ripen, catch the conspirators red-handed in the act of treason, providing undeniable proof of Catholic treachery that would justify the harshest crackdown in English history. Robert Cecil chose to wait. He was a political animal, and he understood that a failed plot was more useful than a prevented one. If he stopped the conspiracy now, the Catholic conspirators could claim they were framed, that the gunpowder was planted, that the whole thing was a government fabrication. Some might even be acquitted by sympathetic juries. But if he caught them in the act, with barrels of gunpowder, slow matches lit, treason undeniable, then he would have perfect justification for crushing Catholic resistance once and for all. So Cecil made his plan. He would watch. He would wait. And at the last possible moment, when the conspirators thought they were about to succeed, he would spring his trap. It was a dangerous game. He was gambling with the lives of the king, the lords, and hundreds of others who would be in Parliament on November 5th. If his timing was even slightly off, if something went wrong, he would be responsible for the greatest catastrophe in English history. But Robert Cecil had confidence in his own brilliance, and he believed God was on his side. While Cecil plotted in Whitehall, the conspirators in Westminster remained blissfully unaware that they were being watched. On November the 1st, 4 days before the state opening, Robert Catesby called a meeting of the core conspirators. They gathered at a safe house in London to finalize their plans. Guy Fawkes was to remain in Westminster, watching over the gunpowder. On the night of November 4th, the night before the state opening, he would make his final preparations. He would position himself in the vault, light his slow match at the appointed time, and then escape across the Thames in a small boat that would be waiting. The remaining conspirators would be positioned at strategic locations around London and the Midlands. As soon as they heard the explosion, they would ride to Combe Abbey to kidnap Princess Elizabeth. Catholic supporters across England would be alerted, and the uprising would begin. It was all planned to the last detail. Every man knew his role. There was nothing left to do but wait. Guy Fawkes returned to the house in Westminster for the last time. He descended into the vault and checked his preparations one final time. The 36 barrels were in position, hidden beneath their camouflage of firewood. His slow matches were ready. His touch paper was prepared. Everything was perfect. He settled in to wait for November 4th. November 2nd came and went. then the third. The other conspirators left London, riding to their assigned positions. The stage was set. But on the morning of November the 4th, Thomas Wintour received disturbing news. Lord Monteagle, his friend and Francis Tresham's brother-in-law, had been to see the king's ministers. No one knew why, but rumors were flying. Wintour rushed to confront Tresham. "Did you warn Monteagle? Did you send him a letter?" Tresham denied it, but his denials were unconvincing. Wintour's gut told him something was wrong. He ran to warn Guy Fawkes. He found him in the house above the vault, calmly preparing his evening meal as if this were any ordinary day. "Abandon the plan," Wintour said breathlessly. "There's been a warning. We may have been betrayed." Guido looked at him with those cold soldier's eyes. "Has anyone searched Parliament?" "Not yet." "Then nothing has changed." If they suspected anything, they would have searched already. The warning must have been vague, dismissed as nonsense. But if they searched tonight, I'll be here. And if they find the powder, at least we tried. Guido's voice was calm, almost serene. "Go. Ride to the others. Tell them to be ready. I will see this through." Thomas Wintour looked at his friend, this soldier who had crossed an ocean to join their cause, and realized that nothing would shake him. Guido Fawkes would either light his barrels and die in glory, or be captured and die under torture, but he would not run. Wintour embraced him and left. It was the last time they would see each other as free men. November 4th, 1605. The sun set over London and darkness fell across Westminster. In the palace, servants prepared for tomorrow's grand ceremony. In the streets, ordinary Londoners settled into their homes for the night, unaware that beneath Parliament, one man sat in darkness with enough explosive to send half the city to hell. Guido Fawkes, alone in the vault, made his final preparations. He checked the powder one last time, arranged his slow matches, positioned his touch paper. He was dressed for travel, boots, cloak, spurs ready. When he lit the fuse, he would have 15 minutes to reach the boat on the Thames and escape. 15 minutes. And then London would erupt in fire. He wondered if his fellow conspirators were in position. He wondered if they would hear the blast from their locations in the Midlands. He wondered if Catholic England would rise as Catesby believed, or if the explosion would simply make things worse. But he did not doubt. Doubt was a luxury for men who still believed in diplomacy. Guido Fawkes had left doubt behind years ago on the battlefields of Flanders. He sat in the darkness and waited for the clock to reach the appointed hour. But upstairs, in Whitehall Palace, Robert Cecil was also making preparations. He had waited as long as he dared. Tomorrow was the state opening. If the conspiracy was real, and the letter suggested it was, then the conspirators would be making their final preparations tonight. It was time to spring the trap. Cecil approached King James with the letter from Monteagle. Together, they analysed its cryptic wording. A terrible blow, this Parliament. They shall not see who hurts them. James, who had nearly been killed in a gunpowder explosion as a child in Scotland, immediately understood. This speaks of hidden violence, something beneath. Search the cellars, Cecil bowed. At once, Your Majesty. But Cecil had no intention of searching immediately, not yet. He wanted to catch the conspirators in the act, not just in preparation. So he waited until late that night, until it was dark. until he was certain that anyone guarding the gunpowder would be in position. Just before midnight on November 4th, Cecil summoned Thomas Knivet, a Westminster magistrate, and gave him a royal warrant. "Search the cellars beneath Parliament," Cecil ordered. "Search everywhere. And if you find anything suspicious, arrest whoever is responsible." Knivet gathered a squad of armed guards, took torches, and descended into the labyrinth beneath Westminster. The cellars beneath Parliament were extensive, a maze of storage vaults, coal rooms, and forgotten spaces. Knivet and his men moved methodically, checking each room. And then, in a rented vault directly beneath the House of Lords, they found him, a tall man standing in the shadows. He didn't try to run, didn't try to fight. He simply stood there, watching them approach with the calm patience of a soldier who had known this moment might come. "Who are you?" Knivet demanded. "What is your business here at this hour?" "My name is John Johnson. I am servant to Mr. Thomas Percy, who rents this vault. I am guarding his property." Knivet looked around the vault. It was filled with piles of firewood and coal. Nothing obviously suspicious. But something about the man's composure unnerved him. And the anonymous letter had warned of hidden danger. "Move that firewood!" Knivet ordered his men. They began clearing the fuel away, and as they did, the barrels were revealed, dozens of them, stamped with powder merchants' marks. Knivet's torch illuminated the scene. His blood turned to ice. "What are these barrels?" Guido said nothing. One of the guards pried open a barrel lid. Inside, black powder, gunpowder, enough to blow Westminster to rubble. Knivet turned back to the tall man in the shadows. "Search him." The guards seized Guido roughly and searched his clothing. In his pockets, slow matches, touch paper, everything needed to light a fuse. He had been minutes away from doing it. "Who are you?" Knivet asked again, his voice hard. "What were you planning?" And Guy Fawkes, knowing that his mission had failed, that his cause was lost, that his life was over, allowed himself one final moment of defiance. He looked Knivet in the eye and spoke the words that would echo through history. "To blow you Scotch beggars, back to Scotland." The guards grabbed him. Iron manacles were clamped on his wrists. And as they dragged him out of the vault and up the stone stairs toward the November night, Guy Fawkes felt no fear. He had tried. He had given everything. And if God had chosen this moment for him to fail, then failure was God's will. He would not beg. He would not plead. He would not betray his friends. He was a soldier, and soldiers know how to die. But what awaited him in the Tower of London was not death. Not yet. First, they would break him. Guy Fawkes was dragged through the streets of London in the cold hours before dawn on November the 5th, 1605. He was thrown into a boat and rowed upriver to the Tower of London, England's most feared fortress and prison. The tower had stood for over 500 years, its thick stone walls rising from the north bank of the Thames. It had been a royal palace, a treasury, and an armory, but it was most famous as a place where enemies of the crown were taken to disappear. Traitors entered the tower, very few left alive. Guido was marched through the Traitors' Gate, a water entrance used for prisoners arriving by river, and taken to a cell in the depths of the fortress. The door slammed shut behind him, and he was left in darkness. He knew what was coming. He had been a soldier long enough to understand what happened to prisoners who refused to talk. He had perhaps hours before the interrogation began. He used that time to prepare himself mentally, to build walls in his mind, to remember his faith and his cause, to steel himself for pain. Just after dawn, they came for him. The interrogation room was cold and bare, a table, a few chairs, candles for light, nothing overtly threatening, not yet. The interrogators were professionals, members of the King's Privy Council, men skilled in extracting information. They started with the soft approach, reasonable questions, a gentle tone. "Tell us your name." "John Johnson." "That's not your real name, is it?" Silence. "Who sent you? Who else is involved in this plot?" Silence. "If you cooperate, it will go easier for you. The king may show mercy." Silence. Guido gave them nothing. He had expected threats, perhaps even immediate violence, but this polite questioning was almost more unnerving. They were testing him, probing for weaknesses. Hours passed. The questions continued, circling the same themes. Names. Co-conspirators. How long had this been planned? Where did the gunpowder come from? Guido answered nothing of substance. He confirmed that he had been found with the barrels, that he had intended to ignite them, but he claimed he acted alone, a lone fanatic, no one else involved. The interrogators didn't believe him for a second. A plot of this scale required planning, money, and multiple people, but without names, without evidence, they couldn't move against the other conspirators. After hours of fruitless questioning, the interrogators left. Guido was returned to his cell, but that night they came again, and this time the questions were accompanied by threats. "We will make you talk. The rack awaits you. You will tell us everything. The only question is how much you'll suffer first." Still, Guido said nothing. And so, on November 6th, King James himself intervened. He signed an order authorizing the use of torture. The written command was chillingly specific. The gentler tortures are to be first used unto him, and so by degrees proceeding to the worst, and so God speed your good work. The King of England, Supreme Governor of the Church, had just ordered his men to torture a prisoner to the point of breaking, and he wished them good luck. The gloves were off. The torture chamber in the Tower of London was a place of nightmares. It was a stone room in the depths of the fortress, lit by torches, with instruments of pain hanging on the walls like tools in a workshop. The most famous of these instruments was the rack. It was a wooden frame, about 7 feet long, with rollers at each end. The prisoners' wrists were tied to one roller, their ankles to the other. As the torturer turned a handle, the rollers would move in opposite directions, slowly pulling the prisoner's body taut. At first, it was merely uncomfortable, a stretching sensation, but as the rollers continued to turn, the stretching became painful, then agonizing. Joints began to pop out of their sockets, tendons tore, bones cracked. The rack didn't kill quickly. It was designed to inflict maximum suffering while keeping the victim alive and conscious. A skilled torturer could stretch a man for hours, bringing him to the edge of death and then pulling back again and again until the prisoner begged to tell everything he knew. On November 7th, Guy Fawkes was strapped to the rack. The guards tied his wrists and ankles to the wooden frame. The torturer, a professional executioner who had done this work for years, explained what was about to happen in a calm, almost bored voice. "You can stop this at any time," he said. "Just give us the names." Guido said nothing. The torturer shrugged and began to turn the handle. At first, Guido remained silent. He had endured pain before, on battlefields, in the hardships of military life. He had trained himself to compartmentalize suffering, to push it into a corner of his mind and lock it away. But the rack was something different. This was not the sudden shock of a wound in battle. This was slow, methodical, escalating agony. Every turn of the handle made it worse, and the torturer was patient, experienced, and utterly without mercy. Hours passed. Guido's body was pulled taut, his joints screaming in protest. The pain was beyond anything he had ever experienced. It became his entire world, a white-hot, all-consuming fire that obliterated thought, faith, courage, everything but the desperate animal need for it to stop. But still, through clenched teeth and muffled screams, he gave them nothing. They unstrapped him and carried him back to his cell, his body a broken, trembling wreck. They gave him water and a few hours to recover, and then they brought him back, again and again and again. The historical record preserves a haunting piece of evidence from Guy Fawkes' torture, his signatures on the interrogation documents. On November 5th, the day of his capture, he signed his confession with a firm, clear hand. The signature reads, Guido, in strong, confident letters. This is the handwriting of a soldier in control of himself. On November 7th, after the first sessions on the rack, his signature is shakier. The letters are less steady, the pressure uneven. His hand is beginning to fail him. By November 9th, the signature is barely recognizable as writing. It's a trembling scrawl, the work of a man whose hands have been destroyed by torture, who can barely hold a pen. This is what the rack did to him. Somewhere between November 7th and November 9th, Guy Fawkes broke. The human body has limits. The human mind has limits. And the rack was specifically designed to find those limits and shatter them. On November 9th, after hours on the rack, Guido finally gave them what they wanted. The names spilled out. Robert Catesby, the leader, the mastermind, the man whose vision had started everything. Thomas Wintour, the recruiter who had brought Guido from Europe. Thomas Percy, the insider with the government connections. John Wright, the soldier, and all the others. The full list of conspirators, their roles, their locations. Guido confessed to everything. The plan to blow up Parliament, the months of preparation, the tunnel they had started and then abandoned, the rental of the vault, the 36 barrels. He told them how the plot had been financed, where the gunpowder had been purchased, when the explosion was meant to occur. He gave them a complete picture of the conspiracy, written in a shaking hand on parchment that would be preserved for 4 centuries as evidence of his torture and his breaking. But by the time Guido broke, it was too late for the interrogators to act quickly. The other conspirators, warned by Thomas Wintour that something had gone wrong, had already fled London. On the morning of November the 5th, when news reached the other conspirators that Guido had been captured and the gunpowder discovered, panic set in. Some urged immediate flight, scatter in different directions, disappear into the countryside, hope that Guido didn't talk. But Robert Catesby refused to run, or rather, he refused to hide. "We go forward," he declared. "The explosion failed, but we still have arms and men. We ride to the Midlands. We seize Princess Elizabeth. We raise the Catholics of England to rebellion. We fight. It was madness, of course. The explosion had been the key to everything. Without the chaos and decapitation of the government, there was no chance of a successful uprising. But Catesby was beyond reason now. He had gambled everything on this plot. He had nothing left to lose. About a dozen conspirators, with a few dozen servants and supporters, rode north out of London. They stole horses from inns along the way, gathering weapons as they went. Their plan, if it could still be called a plan, was to reach Combe Abbey, kidnap Princess Elizabeth, and use her as a figurehead for a Catholic rebellion. But as they rode through the Midlands, reality crashed down on them. No one joined them. The Catholics they had hoped would rise in support stayed in their homes, doors locked, terrified of being associated with the failed plot. Messages they sent to Catholic gentry went unanswered. The uprising they had dreamed of was stillborn. By November 7th, the conspirators had reached Holbeche House in Staffordshire, the home of one of their supporters. They were exhausted, low on supplies, and beginning to realize that they were not revolutionaries leading a great Catholic uprising. They were fugitives running from the inevitable. And then things got worse. Someone had the idea to dry some gunpowder by the fire. Their powder had gotten damp in the rain during the flight. It was a desperate, stupid mistake. A spark from the fire landed in the open powder. The explosion was small compared to what would have happened at Westminster, but in the enclosed space of the house, it was devastating. Robert Catesby was badly burned, nearly blinded. Several others were wounded, and then, as they were still recovering from the blast, they heard the sound they had been dreading. Horses, lots of them, and the shouts of armed men. The Sheriff of Worcester had raised a force of 200 men and tracked the conspirators to Holbeche House. The house was now surrounded. The sun rose on November 8th, 1605, to reveal a small stone house surrounded by armed men. Inside, a dozen wounded, exhausted, desperate conspirators prepared for their final stand. Robert Catesby, his face burned and his eyes barely able to see, loaded his pistols. John Wright checked his sword. Thomas Wintour said a prayer. They could have surrendered. They could have thrown down their weapons and begged for mercy, but they knew what mercy meant in Tudor England. It meant the Tower, the rack, a trial that was a formality, and then the scaffold, where they would be hanged, cut down while still alive, and butchered while conscious. Catesby looked at his fellow conspirators, these men who had followed him into hell itself. "I would rather die here," he said, "than give them the satisfaction of killing me in London." The others nodded. They were in agreement. They would die fighting. The sheriff's men called for surrender. The conspirators refused. And then the shooting started. It was not a long battle. The conspirators were outnumbered 20 to 1 and had nowhere to run. Musket balls tore through the windows of Holbeche House. The conspirators fired back, but they were trapped. Robert Catesby and Thomas Percy stood together near a window, reloading their weapons. And then, in one of history's strange coincidences, a single musket ball passed through both men. Catesby was hit in the chest, Percy in the shoulder. Both fell. Percy died immediately. Catesby, mortally wounded, crawled across the floor to a picture of the Virgin Mary hanging on the wall. He clutched it to his chest and died holding it, a final prayer on his lips. John Wright was shot dead as well. The others, Thomas Wintour, Ambrose Rookwood, John Grant, and the rest were wounded and captured alive. The conspiracy was broken. The rebellion that never was over. The only sounds were the groans of the wounded and the triumphant shouts of the sheriff's men. Robert Catesby, the mastermind who had dreamed of toppling a kingdom, was dead in a pool of blood in a country house, his grand vision reduced to a footnote. But the story was far from over, because the captured conspirators were about to be taken to London, to the Tower, to face the same interrogators who had broken Guy Fawkes. And then, when all the information had been extracted, they would face something far worse: the scaffold. On January 27th, 1606, 8 surviving conspirators were brought to trial in Westminster Hall. The location was deliberately chosen, the same building complex they had tried to destroy. The men who shuffled into the courtroom barely resembled the proud Catholic gentlemen who had plotted revolution months before. They had spent weeks in the Tower, many on the rack, all broken in body, if not in spirit. Guy Fawkes could barely walk. His hands were mangled, his body twisted from torture. He had to be carried into the courtroom and propped up so he could stand for the reading of charges. Thomas Wintour's arm was in a splint from the gunshot wound at Holbeche House. Ambrose Rookwood and the others bore the marks of capture and interrogation. The trial itself was a formality. In Tudor England, trials for treason were not about determining guilt. That had already been decided. They were about public confession and official condemnation. The Attorney General, Sir Edward Coke, presented the evidence. It was damning and complete thanks to the confessions extracted in the Tower. He described the plot in detail: the rental of the vault, the 36 barrels of gunpowder, the plan to blow up King and Parliament. He presented signed confessions from the conspirators themselves. He painted a picture of Catholic treachery so complete, so monstrous, that it justified any and all measures against Catholics in England. The defendants were not allowed to speak in their own defense. They were not allowed to call witnesses. They simply stood and listened as their own words, extracted through torture, were used to condemn them. The verdict was pronounced swiftly: guilty of high treason. And then came the sentence. It was read aloud in the formal language of English law, but its meaning was brutally clear. The 8 men would be taken to the place of execution and there, hanged by the neck, but cut down while still alive. Their genitals cut off and burned before their eyes, their stomachs opened and their intestines drawn out, beheaded, and their bodies cut into 4 quarters to be displayed around London as a warning to anyone who might consider treason. This was the punishment for high treason in England. It was called being hanged, drawn, and quartered. And it was designed to be the most painful, most humiliating, most terrifying death the law could devise. The condemned men heard the sentence in silence. There was no point in protesting, no point in begging for mercy. They were taken back to the Tower to await execution day. January 31st, 1606, dawned cold and grey over London. A large crowd had gathered in Old Palace Yard, Westminster, right beside the building the conspirators had tried to destroy. A scaffold had been erected, tall enough that the entire crowd could see. This was meant to be a public spectacle, a warning etched in blood and pain. The 8 condemned men were brought out one by one. They had been tied to wooden hurdles, flat sleds, and dragged through the streets from the Tower to Westminster. This was part of the humiliation, arriving at your execution covered in mud and filth. The crowd jeered and threw refuse. These were not martyrs to be mourned. They were traitors, and the mob had come to watch them suffer. The first to die were those considered less important: Ambrose Rookwood, Robert Keyes, and Thomas Wintour. Each was made to climb the scaffold ladder. The noose was placed around their necks. They were given a chance to speak, to repent. Some did. Others remained defiant to the end. Then the ladder was pulled away. But the rope was carefully measured so they would not die quickly. They hung there, strangling, legs kicking, faces turning purple. After a few minutes, when they were unconscious but not dead, they were cut down. The executioner, a professional who had done this work many times, went to work with his knives. I will not describe in detail what happened next. The historical record makes it clear enough. The execution of a traitor in Tudor England was designed to make observers sick with horror. It was designed to make men think twice before ever committing treason. And it worked. Each execution took 20 to 30 minutes of unspeakable agony before death finally came. The crowd watched in sick fascination, some cheering, some turning away, but none able to fully look away from the horror. One by one, the condemned men died screaming. Finally, it was Guy Fawkes' turn. He was the last. The grand finale. The man who had been found with the match, who would have lit the fuse, who would have single-handedly destroyed the government of England if he'd had 5 more minutes. The crowd's bloodlust was at its peak. They wanted to see him suffer most of all. Guido was dragged to the scaffold. His body was broken from torture, emaciated from months in the tower. He could barely stand. They placed the noose around his neck. He was asked if he repented. In a weak voice, he asked forgiveness from the king and the state, but not from God. He still believed his cause had been just, even if it had failed. They positioned him on the scaffold ladder. The executioner prepared for his work, his knives sharpened, his tools ready. The crowd leaned forward, anticipating the spectacle. And then Guy Fawkes, with his last shred of strength, did something extraordinary. He jumped. He threw himself from the ladder with enough force that when the rope snapped taut, his neck broke cleanly. He died instantly. The executioner, denied his full performance, stared at the body in frustration. The crowd was stunned into momentary silence. Guy Fawkes had cheated them, cheated the executioner, cheated the state of its full measure of vengeance. Even broken, tortured, defeated, he had won one final battle. He had died on his own terms. The executioner still performed the drawing and quartering on the corpse. The law demanded it. But Guido felt none of it. He was already gone. His head was placed on a spike on London Bridge, to rot in the sun as a warning to traitors. His body parts were displayed at the 4 corners of the city, but the man himself, the soldier, the zealot, the believer who had crossed an ocean to fight for his faith, he had escaped at the end. And in that final defiant leap, he became something more than a failed terrorist. He became a legend. The Gunpowder Plot failed, but in many ways, it succeeded beyond the conspirators' worst nightmares, just not in the way they intended. They had wanted to spark a Catholic uprising, to free their co-religionists from persecution. Instead, they brought down upon English Catholics a wave of repression that would last for generations. Within days of the plot's discovery, anti-Catholic hysteria swept England. Mobs attacked Catholic homes. Priests who had lived in relative safety were hunted down with renewed vigor. Catholics who had nothing to do with the plot were arrested on suspicion. Parliament, meeting in emergency session, passed a series of harsh new laws. Catholics were forbidden from living in London unless they had special permission. They could not practice law or medicine. They could not serve as officers in the army. They could not vote or hold any government position. The Popish Recusants Act of 1606 imposed even heavier fines for not attending Protestant services. Catholics were required to take an oath of allegiance that specifically denied the Pope's authority, something many devout Catholics could not in good conscience do. It was everything the plotters had feared, made worse by what they had tried to do. The cruel irony was inescapable. Robert Catesby and his co-conspirators, believing themselves saviors of English Catholics, had instead guaranteed their continued suffering for generations to come. The Gunpowder Plot became the justification for anti-Catholic laws that would remain on the books for over 200 years. It became the bogeyman that Protestant preachers invoked whenever they wanted to stir up fear and hatred. It became proof in the Protestant mind that Catholics could never be trusted, that they were all potential traitors waiting for the Pope's signal to destroy England. The 8 men who died on the scaffold thought they were martyrs. In reality, they were the opposite. They had betrayed their own cause more completely than any Protestant agent could have. But for Protestant England, November 5th became a day of thanksgiving and celebration. King James declared it an annual holiday, a day to remember God's mercy in delivering England from the Catholic plot. Special church services were held to thank the Lord for the king's narrow escape. The Book of Common Prayer was updated to include a special prayer for November 5th, praising God for the wonderful and mighty deliverance from the most traitorous and bloody intended massacre. And the people of London celebrated in a more visceral way. On the first anniversary of the plot's discovery, November the 5th, 1606, Londoners lit bonfires across the city. They built crude effigies of Guy Fawkes and threw them into the flames. Fireworks, the same gunpowder that had nearly destroyed Parliament, now used for celebration, lit up the night sky. The tradition stuck. Year after year, November 5th became Bonfire Night or Guy Fawkes Night. Children built effigies of Guy Fawkes, a stuffed figure made of old clothes and straw, and paraded them through the streets, begging for a penny for the guy. At night, the effigies would be burned on enormous bonfires while crowds cheered. Remember the 5th of November, gunpowder treason and plot. I see no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. The rhyme, composed in the years after the plot, was taught to children as a warning and a celebration. It ensured that the Gunpowder Plot would never be forgotten. But here's the strange part. Over time, the meaning of the celebration began to shift. In the beginning, it was a purely Protestant festival, a celebration of Catholic defeat. But as centuries passed and religious tensions in England cooled, the holiday became more secular. It became simply a fun night for fireworks and bonfires, with only the vaguest connection to its historical origins. And Guy Fawkes himself began a strange transformation in the cultural imagination. For the first 200 years after his death, Guy Fawkes was remembered as a villain, the devil incarnate, the face of Catholic treachery. His name was synonymous with treason and terrorism. But by the 19th century, something curious started to happen. The Romantic movement in literature and art began to re-examine historical figures who had rebelled against authority. Byron, Shelley, and other poets wrote with sympathy about revolutionaries and outcasts. And in this new cultural context, Guy Fawkes began to look different. He was still a failed terrorist, yes, but he was also a man who had stood alone against a powerful state. A man who, right or wrong, had been driven by genuine conviction rather than personal gain. A man who had suffered torture without betraying his friends. There was something almost heroic in that, even if his cause was indefensible. In 1841, William Harrison Ainsworth published a novel called Guy Fawkes, or The Gunpowder Treason, which portrayed Fawkes as a tragic, romantic figure rather than a pure villain. The book was enormously popular and helped reshape public perception. By the Victorian era, Guy Fawkes' Night had lost most of its anti-Catholic venom. Catholics in England had been gradually granted more rights throughout the 19th century. They could vote, hold office, practice their faith openly. The old religious hatreds had faded, and in their place, a strange kind of admiration for Guy Fawkes emerged, not for what he tried to do, but for how he did it. For his nerve, his patience, his refusal to break easily, his defiant death. He became a symbol of the lone individual standing against authority, and that symbol would only grow more powerful in the 20th century. In 1982, a British writer named Alan Moore and an illustrator named David Lloyd created a graphic novel called V for Vendetta. It was set in a dystopian future where fascists had taken over Britain, and it told the story of a mysterious anarchist revolutionary who wore a Guy Fawkes mask. The character, known only as V, used the Guy Fawkes imagery deliberately. He saw Fawkes as a symbol of rebellion against tyranny. And in the climax of the story, V succeeds where Fawkes failed. He destroys Parliament with explosives, but only after evacuating everyone, making it a symbolic rather than murderous act. When V for Vendetta was adapted into a film in 2006, the Guy Fawkes mask became globally iconic. The stylized white mask with its thin moustache, pointed beard, and eerily smiling expression became instantly recognizable. And then, something extraordinary happened. In the 2000s and 2010s, activists around the world began wearing Guy Fawkes masks at protests. The hacktivist group Anonymous adopted it as their symbol. Occupy Wall Street protesters wore it. Anti-government demonstrators from Hong Kong to Brazil to Egypt wore it. The mask became a universal symbol of resistance to authority, of the individual standing against the system, of revolution and rebellion. This was astounding. A 17th century Catholic terrorist who tried to commit mass murder had become, 4 centuries later, the face of 21st century protest movements. Most of the people wearing the mask had no idea who Guy Fawkes really was. They didn't know the history of the Gunpowder Plot. They didn't know about the religious wars, or the torture, or the failed Catholic uprising. They just knew the mask represented fighting back against power, and that was enough. It's one of history's strangest transformations. Guy Fawkes, who failed completely in his own time, won a kind of immortality in ours, not for his faith or his cause, but for being willing to fight at all. But there's one final question about the Gunpowder Plot that has never been fully answered. Did Robert Cecil know all along? Remember, Cecil was England's Spymaster. He had informants everywhere. His intelligence network penetrated Catholic circles throughout Europe. And there is evidence, strong evidence, that he knew about the plot months before it was supposed to happen. Some historians believe Cecil didn't just uncover the plot. They believe he helped create it. Think about the convenient timing of everything. the conspirators managed to rent a vault directly beneath the House of Lords, in one of the most secure buildings in England, without anyone questioning why Thomas Percy needed so much storage space right there. The gunpowder was purchased and moved into position over months, and no one noticed. The anonymous letter warning Lord Monteagle appeared at exactly the right moment, late enough that the conspirators were fully committed, but early enough to stop them before anyone got hurt. And Cecil's reaction to the letter was suspiciously calm. He didn't panic. He didn't order an immediate search. He waited. He let the plot develop. Some historians argue that Cecil, knowing about Catholic unrest, allowed or even encouraged the conspiracy to develop. He may have had agents provocateurs pushing the plotters toward more extreme action. And then, at the perfect moment, he exposed it all. Why? Because a failed Catholic plot was the perfect political weapon. It justified harsh anti-Catholic laws. It secured the Protestant succession. It made Cecil himself invaluable to the king as the man who had saved the nation. If this theory is true, and we'll never know for certain, then the real conspiracy wasn't the one to blow up Parliament. It was the one to let the plotters think they could succeed, right up until the moment they were caught red-handed. Guy Fawkes and his fellow conspirators would have been pawns in a much larger game, manipulated by forces they never understood. Or maybe not. Maybe they were exactly what they appeared to be, desperate men who planned a terrible act and got caught. History doesn't give us neat answers. It gives us fragments, clues, and questions that echo across centuries. What we know for certain is this. On November the 5th, 1605, England came within hours of experiencing the most catastrophic terrorist attack in its history. And the man standing in the cellar with the match, ready to light the fuse, was a soldier named Guy Fawkes who believed he was doing God's work. He failed. He was broken. He died. But his face lived on. Every year on November 5th, people across Britain light bonfires and set off fireworks. Children wave sparklers in the dark. Families gather to watch Guy Fawkes burn in effigy. Remember the 5th of November. But what exactly are we remembering? Are we celebrating the failure of a terrorist plot? The survival of a king and a parliament? The victory of Protestant England over Catholic treason? Or are we, perhaps unconsciously, celebrating something else? The audacity of the attempt, the nerve of one man standing in darkness, ready to strike a blow against the mightiest empire in Europe. The answer depends on who you ask. To 17th century Protestant England, Guy Fawkes was the ultimate villain. Proof that Catholics could never be trusted, that vigilance against treason was always necessary. To 17th century Catholics, he was a tragic figure, a faithful man pushed to desperation by persecution, whose failure made everything worse. To modern activists, wearing his mask, he's a symbol of rebellion against authority, stripped of his actual religious and political context. And to historians, he's a puzzle, a man whose life and death reveal the bloody fault lines of early modern Europe, where religion and politics were so intertwined that faith could justify mass murder. The real Guy Fawkes was a soldier who became a zealot, a man trained by war, hardened by exile, radicalized by persecution. He spent months alone in a cellar with enough explosives to level half of London. He endured torture without immediately breaking. He died defiantly, denying his executioners their full satisfaction. Was he brave? Undeniably. Was he a monster? By any reasonable moral standard, yes. Planning to murder hundreds of people, including innocents, in the name of religion is monstrous, no matter how sincere your beliefs. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Guy Fawkes was a monster created by other monsters. He was radicalized by a system that criminalized his faith, that hunted his priests, that fined his family into poverty, that made it illegal for him to exist openly as who he was. The Gunpowder Plot didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because England's Protestant state had pushed Catholics to the margins, had made them perpetual suspects, had left them with no legal recourse and no hope for change. That doesn't justify what Fawkes tried to do. Nothing justifies mass murder. But it explains how a man could reach the point where mass murder seemed like his only option. And that's the real lesson of the Gunpowder Plot. Not that Catholics were treacherous, not that Protestants were oppressive, but that when you create a class of outcasts, when you persecute people for their beliefs, when you leave them no path to dignity or peace, you create the conditions for extremism. You create Guy Fawkes. The plotters wanted to save English Catholics. Instead, they doomed them to 2 more centuries of persecution. The irony is tragic and complete. But 400 years later, Guy Fawkes won a different kind of victory. His face became eternal. His story became legend. And every November 5th, the world remembers his name. Not the names of the kings who persecuted Catholics, not the politicians who passed anti-Catholic laws, not even Robert Cecil, the Spymaster who probably orchestrated his capture. Guy Fawkes, the devil beneath Parliament, the man with the match. So tonight, as fireworks light up the sky, ask yourself, what are we really celebrating? The failure of the plot or the audacity of the attempt? The answer might scare you. This was the story of Guy Fawkes, the soldier who became a terrorist, the Catholic who tried to blow up Protestant England, the man who died defiantly on a scaffold and became the face of rebellion itself. What do you think? Was Guy Fawkes a villain or a tragic figure? A terrorist or a freedom fighter? A monster or a victim of his time? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this journey into the darkest chapter of English history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Click the notification bell so you never miss an episode as we continue to explore the shadows where history hides its most terrible truths. Thank you for watching. Thank you for keeping the candle lit. And remember, the 5th of November.